This is Ed Robinson. Last time we considered classes, but now we will consider how to compile and reuse a class. We briefly discussed how to make a class and how to make objects of that class instances. What we're going to do now, we will return to that in much more detail, but just to give you the overall idea of why we would want to make a class before we go into its detail. What we're going to do basically is take the two sections. Here's our class and here's the main which calls the class, so to speak. I'm going to simply take this bit of code here and compile it. We'll create our first class library program. So I'll start a new project, and then from Visual C we'll take the class library net framework, which will produce a dynamic linked library. And I've got a name here which is class library 1, which is good enough for me at the moment, but I think it's important to be particular about where you put this project. So I'm going to go to a folder that I can easily find. I think that's quite important. You'll spend quite a bit of time trying to find these things, so we know it's in a particular folder. So I can click OK on that and start to create my class library. So we can dispense with that. We want to maybe change our class name to part to be consistent with what the code that we have got. And when we do that, it said, would you ask to change? So you notice it changed here from class 1 to part. So that's the name of our class. I can now introduce some code into this. As I mentioned, that constitutes a class. The most important thing is that the data is private, usually, for a class, and the functions which access that data are public. We can now build our solution or compile it. I'm going to show you exactly what that means. So we've got success here, so we've built some executable code. Now let's take a look at it. The file can be a bit tricky to find, but let's take a look. If we go to File, Open, and then Open File, and we look up here, it's already in the folder there. You'll have to navigate to that perhaps, and usually in the bin folder, and it could be in the debug or release, one or the other. Mine happens to be in the debug. Now take a look at class 1 DLL, which is indeed an executable program. They can have an extension of DLL, dynamic linked library, or exe is another form of the compiled. So what I'm going to do is to open it, but I'm going to open with down here on the right. Open with. You may or may not have this feature where you have a binary editor, but I'm going to click on that, and there's my executable program. Now that doesn't mean anything to anybody except a few hints on what it's used for and so on, but basically this is executable code. If you take any of these elements, for example 4D, that's a hexadecimal number. It represents 4 16s, 64 plus 13 added together. So that will represent 77. So hexadecimal is just a shorthand way of writing decimal numbers. It's for a purpose. The purpose of hexadecimal is to make it easier. It's a form of binary numbers, as a matter of fact. It's a shorthand way of writing binary numbers where zeros and ones, which they're instructions for the microprocessor. But that doesn't concern us. The main thing is that it doesn't mean anything to us. It means lots of things to the microprocessor. So it's directly talking to the microprocessor. So it's executable code which we can't read, but the microprocessor does. So what we're going to do next is build another program, a separate project, which will utilize this compiled code. So let's make another project which will utilize this code. So I'll just close this solution completely for the moment and start a new project. Now this time we're going to build a console application, and it doesn't matter what we call it, and then click OK, and that should start. Now we don't really need the rest of these usings. What we need to do first is to set a reference to our project, and to do that we go through project and then add a reference, and that's it there. That's come up. You may have to browse for it by clicking down here and browse to that folder, and that's where it's important to remember where it is. So we can click OK on that, and then now we can introduce the code that we want to use in our main, which is going to access our class executable. Now it's showing in red there because there's something missing in here, and that's the using statement. So that that's no longer red, so that looks promising. So let's now just build that. And indeed that seems to have built okay, and so now we can just run the program, and you can see it works basically. So what it's done here, it's set the data to 1. I'll go through this in a lot more detail. We're just giving an overview of how a class is being used, so don't worry if you don't quite understand this, but we're setting the data and then we're printing out the value as well, which is we're getting the data. But you'll notice this function is inside the executable code, and the class, indeed, when we make a class, then this is how we understand that this class is in a compiled section of code. So now that you've got an idea of how we compile a class usually and utilize the class from within main, let's return to some fundamentals of making a class. Just to remind you, we have the data, which is private, and we have functions called methods which access that data. So what we've done, we're setting the value of I in here. Maybe I could just single step through that to show you how that works. So I could put a breakpoint down here, and then run the program, and it runs down to here. Then I can notice that I've opened my locals window, and I can take a look at this P1. So if I F11 in my code, you can see that P1 now has got an I and an S. They're both actually not initialized, or 1 to 0 in fact, and empty for the character. But watch what happens now. P1 set data, it ought to call this method up here. Let's see if that's true. So if I press F11, you'll see that n has been passed the value of 1. Now n is just a dummy variable in order to set our private variable, which is I. So you'll see that n has got the value of 1, and it's about to be transferred to I. And you'll probably see that over here. This is the name of P. This is the current object, which in this case is P1. Another name for it if you like. So I should see now that this I here is indeed initialized to 1. I can now come out of the setData method, and now I call the getData, which goes into the class to get the data. So it should indeed come up here to the getData method. Let's see. So I press F11, indeed it does, and now it returns the value of I. It returns it to the writeLine function, which will print out the value of I being equal to 1, as you can see. As an exercise, what I think you could do is to write similar methods which will set the character S and access and print out the character S as well. So you could pause the video here and try that for yourself. If not, take a look. I might just bring these up a bit. and then I'm going to make similar functions for s, similar methods I should say. So I'll just cheat a bit and just copy those down and then change them as required. So I need to give it a name, so I'll set the data s and get s, and instead of setting an integer I'm going to be, of course, be setting a character, and this is also going to be returning a character. I could call it n if you like, but I'll change it to c, and then I'm going to say that my data s is going to be equal to c. Then I'm going to return the value of s. Okay, then I need to be able to access those as well, so, and set them for a start. So if I just copy that down and set s in here, and I can set that to, for example, I can set it to a character a or something. And then I can write it out as well. And then I can just run it and hope that it will set the value. Oh, so it's just printing out the value of the 1 and the a, which is fine. You might like to single step through that. I think that'd be very instructive to do that, to see how you set and get the data. Let's talk about constructors. A constructor, these are called automatically when an object is instantiated. They're a type of function, or as we call them, methods, but they're automatically called. Let's see what we mean by that. So a constructor is used to set data automatically, so we don't need a set data function, or method we should call it. So what we need to do is to make a constructor. Now, constructor always has the same name as the class, and we can use 2 curly braces to indicate that it's a method. We can set our internal data to, for example, 1, as we did before, initialize the value, but we need to make our method public. So let's now put a breakpoint here and run our code down to here, and then I can F11 to single step. Now notice here P1 has not been assigned at the moment so I'll now create it. So F11 will create P1, and notice what it does. Isn't that amazing? Because it goes and calls automatically that function to set the data equal to 1. So a constructor is a method which gets called automatically when we create a new object. So I'll just F11, and you'll see over here that at the moment it's 0, but then as I F11 you'll notice this I indeed is initialized to 1 by the constructor. Then of course I can call my getData to actually print out the value, which is 1, which we saw previously. So as an exercise, we might like to start with this code and use a constructor to set the value of s as well. So we'll just delete this for a start, now, as I say, you can now start with this code and make a constructor. So we don't therefore need this, so we can actually delete this. This is our setting the data, so our constructor is going to take on that function. So indeed, now you could pause the video and try that yourself. So to make a constructor, we're going to, well, we can utilize the constructor that we've got, because this is what we call a default constructor, or a no parameter constructor, and we can only obviously have one no parameter constructor. So we need to therefore in here to initialize our value of s, and then that should work. But I've now included this function here to write out the value as well. So if we run that, you should find that the values have been initialized to, and you can print out the value of the 1 and the value of s. So this is a no parameter constructor. We'll talk now about a 1 parameter constructor. Let me just remove this so I can just focus on I. So at the moment we've got a no parameter constructor, and we don't get much choice. When we create our object, we don't get any choice in setting the value of I. So that's what we'd like to do. We'd like to be able to create an object, and we could call it part 2, for example, and we would then give it a value by putting the value here. We want to set the I equal to 3. So we need another constructor. So let's make our 1 parameter constructor. I'll just drag that down and copy this, give me a bit of a start. It's got the same name, of course, as the class, and what we're going to do is to pass it a value. So if I now create another object called P2, for example, and I want to eventually print that data out from P2, I'll just comment this out for the moment just to concentrate on P2, calling the 1 parameter constructor. Now the parameter is actually passed in here, and therefore the 3 will actually be passed to the j, and therefore we need to say here that I is equal to j. So let's try that out. So I'll put a breakpoint down here and then run to the breakpoint, and now I'll single step it. If I do an F11, where is it going to go now? Have a look, have a guess where it's going to go. It's going to go up to here. Let's see if that's true. I press F11 and you can see the value of 3 has been passed to j. So j is like a dummy variable. It's not used. So that j now is passed to our internal variable, if you like, which is I. The private variable belonging to the class is set to 3. So now I can return, and then P2 should call the get data as we saw before, and that should therefore produce the value of 3, as you can see. As an exercise, you might like to reintroduce our variable c here and make a constructor, a 2 parameter constructor. We've got here a 1 parameter constructor. I'd like you to make a 2 parameter constructor. You could pause the video here and have a go yourself. Before we start, we might like to resurrect our methods for getting the character, and now you might like to try that yourself now to make a 2-parameter constructor, in which case you might like to pause the video, and now we can see how it's done. So what I'll do is just utilize what I've got here at the moment and just drag that down, control drag, and I'm going to use 2 parameters, so I can put here character C, for example, and what I'll need to do is to have this, the internal variable, so to speak, is going to be put equal to the dummy variable which has been passed to that method. And the way, I'll just comment these out too so we can see the wood from the trees, and I'm going to make a P3, so I can just copy this down for the moment, control drag, part P3, and I'm going to be passing 2 parameters, so I can pass an integer and a character. And I'm going to be printing those out, the integer and the character, so I'll just change those to the current object. Then I can build that. And then run it, and just hope that we get our 2 values out, which are the 4 and the A. So it would be a good idea to single step that as well. So if I'll put my breakpoint here and then run it, and you can see which one is going to get called. If I press F11, it's going to go and call this constructor here, you see, and it passes the value of A gets passed to C, the value of 4 gets passed to J. These are once again just dummy variables, you could use anything you like there, but they are then, the 4 is passed to our private data variable, so I will indeed become 4, as you could probably see over here in a moment. If I just F11, you can see that I becomes 4, as here it's gone red down here, and now S equals C, you can see it becomes the character A as well. So that's how we use a 2-parameter constructor. Now, as an exercise, you might like to make a 3-parameter constructor and use a double data member, we'll call it K for example, and give it a value of 4.5 using the constructor. In the next video we'll be considering chaining constructors, properties, object initializers, overloading methods, and partial classes.